So let me first please welcome everyone, and thanks very much for joining. So you're joining the second working group on open science financing and incentives. Next slide, please. So this meeting is, of course, in the context of the implementation of the UNESCO Recommendation on Open Science. And it's one of the 5 thematic working groups that have been set up. And you can see from the slide here, the others are policies and strategies, monitoring framework, capacity building, and open science infrastructures. But today we are focusing on financing and incentives, as I'm sure you all know by now. And let me say a special welcome to all those who are joining one of these working groups for the first time. And again, welcome back if you've already joined or participated in this or another of the sessions. So just very briefly, my name's Ezra Clark. I'm the Chief of Section of Science, Technology, Innovation Policy in the Natural Sciences sector here in UNESCO. And we're encouraged by the interest in this group, and we're already more than 40 people have joined us, which is very good for our second session. Thanks very much. Can we jump to the next slide, please? So as you can see from the agenda, we'll start with after a brief introduction, we'll start with a presentation on the draft guidance for open science funding. And after that, we'll open the floor for discussions on this document and the issues related to it. Next slide, please. So what are the objectives of this second open science funding and incentives workshops? So really just to make the point, we'll really be focusing on the regional and thematic open science funding mechanisms. Now, the other major component under consideration of this working group is that you can see below recommendations for revision of current research career assessments and evaluation criteria. And that whole area will be covered in a subsequent meeting. So for now, we're focusing on the funding mechanism aspects. Slide. So from the first meeting, those that were there, and as a quick, I guess, summary for those who didn't participate in this first meeting, there were a number of key questions which were posed, which are listed here on the screen and discussed during that meeting. So very quickly to go over those, they were existing open science funding mechanisms. So an idea of what works, what doesn't work, proposals for regional open science funding mechanisms and who are the key players, really to identify the key players. Proposal for thematic open science funding mechanisms. And then we also discussed, although we won't focus too much on that today, existing initiatives for reviewing research assessment and career evaluation and recommendations for revision of the current research, careers assessment and evaluation criteria. So really we'll focus today on these top 3. And as I said, the second part, the second major component will be dealt with separately in a subsequent meeting. So, following that meeting, we requested the working group members to provide inputs and information around these kind of major questions and what was discussed. And we received a number of inputs, and would like to thank all those that took the time to prepare and submit these reports. And you can see those summarized in the table. So while I guess relatively modest in actual number, we had 13 responses. The inputs did represent a reasonably broad range of type of actor who responded. So we can see here, you know, it was broadly covered research institutions, students, policymakers, professional societies, other professionals, libraries and publishers. So we had a broad spread in terms of actor, and in terms of region, a regional spread too, but it would of course be interesting to have more information and particularly a more broader geographical balance as we go forward. But that's very much appreciated, and thanks once again to everyone who provided information and inputs on this. So from that, we then integrated all these inputs into a short document called Guidance for Open Science Funding. And this was sent to everybody yesterday, and this is the email it came from. So please, if you haven't received it, please let us know, and we can, of course, provide that to you. And with that brief introduction, this thing brings us to the main part of the meeting, and that is to consider and to review this document. And for this purpose, then I would like please to give the floor to my colleague Tiffany Stranzer, who will take us through this report. So I'll hand over to you, Tiffany, please. You have the floor.
Thank you, Ezra. And thanks again to all of you who sent in questions and suggestions as we try to unpack the next steps for nurturing open science from a financial perspective. So let's start with a first basic question. If we can go to the next slide, please. The first question is, why does open science need funding? When our goal is to transition to science that is open by default, what are the financial barriers and what is the usefulness of finance in that transition? The recommendation is clear about the costs of open science and of the transition to open science. And you'll see these in the document that you have in front of you. But briefly here, I'll just mention that we know there are financial aspects to the kind of training that we need for open science to put it into action, into practice. And we know that there are financial needs as we develop and maintain open science infrastructures, systems, and digital public goods that facilitate working openly and inclusively as a larger community. There are also financial aspects to the adoption of equitable open practices. Many of these practices require time or tools or skills that may not be part of science as usual in a given institution or a given scientific community. And among those, we must also consider open science communication, public engagement, and related activities. So it's important to note that when we're transforming our processes for funding and for assessment of the research projects that will receive funding, that can increase the pace and the extent of the transition to open science. So we can look toward a future in which research that does not take into account the values and principles of open science simply isn't a target for public funding. In other words, we can consider the use of open science practices, principles, and values as one of the core costs of doing research. Next slide, please. So just as a reminder for us all, when we talk about openness in science, we mean integration of the values and principles of open science into our research and into our funding schemes. By going back to these core values and principles, we can advance the assessment and funding conversation. And I think it's important, particularly here, to note the collective benefit. When we spend on open science, that spending has a broader reach than if we were to spend that equivalent money on science that isn't open. And the recommendation urges us to maximize the impact of public funding. Next slide, please. So when we're taking the cue from the recommendation and from your inputs, we boil down to the following guidance for strengthening open science funding. The first bit of guidance is to make sure that we integrate open science principles into existing funding mechanisms. This means reviewing our existing funding to know what money is flowing where, and it means working openly as we monitor, as we adapt, and as we transform those funding mechanisms. And again, you'll see more detail in the document in front of you. The second approach was to shift our incentives to make sure that they are aligned with open science. This means revising our assessment of science and of researchers to consider all of the efforts involved to create open science and all of the varied outputs of scientific research beyond simply publications. Importantly, this may also mean assessing science not just by its outputs and not just by its outputs that are easily measured with existing proxies, but also by innovating in the ways that we define scientific excellence. The core of a funding transition, or the funding that we need for open science, is of course the finance that we need to operationalize open science. This is a very practical step, but it starts with being clear about what those costs are. So let's begin by quantifying and supporting the real costs of the open science practices, services, and infrastructures that we've already come to use in many situations. And under this point, let's also make sure that funding supports each of the pillars of open science as defined in the recommendation on open science. So that means open access to scientific knowledge, open science infrastructures, open engagement with societal actors, and open dialogue with other knowledge systems. And we need to do that while respecting disciplinary and project diversity. You'll see some specific mention in the document of priority aspects, practices, and services. And I think it's key for us to remember that the open availability of a public good right now does not mean that it's free to create that or to sustain it. So again, we have to start by identifying the real costs and ways to equitably share those costs as a global scientific community. So within that, we must increase the transparency and equity of the funding process. Let's make sure that there are seats at the table for all in these important conversations. We can definitely improve transparency in scientific funding, as well as transparency in our decisions about funding and what gets funded. And finally, let's ensure that non-compliance affects the eligibility for future funding. In other words, let's give these changes some teeth. So this guidance is high level, and our job is to make it relevant to all the global players involved in funding open science. Next slide, please. It's important for us to consider who those players are, not only in terms of who can and should provide finance, but also who should be included in monitoring and decision-making that is related to funding. We heard clearly from you that the intent is for all science funders to become funders of open science to the greatest extent possible. At present, there are some invisible costs of open science, invisible in the sense that these costs are being addressed through unpaid labor or through short-term projects that sometimes result in a public good, but that public good will then require strategic investment to ensure that it is available over the long term for the service of open science. So we need to identify these players and their costs, and we need to create or strengthen mechanisms that ensure that science funding is aligned with their needs and is accessible to those who need it most. And we can also consider the open modes of working within science funding, asking who helps to choose what is funded. This work has two components. One is opening up the review of projects and the tracking of funds, making those systems open and inclusive to the greatest extent possible. The other is identifying how we can measure the quality of proposed work from the perspective of openness. This returns us to the concept of research assessment, which is familiar to those of you who joined our working group meeting last week on the development of a monitoring framework for the recommendation. Let's just say for now that we have a lot to learn from each other as we turn this guidance into action and as we learn how to gauge the impacts of that action. So once again, this document is high level, and we are keen to hear from you how it serves your needs and what revisions you need to make it more useful. Before we jump into discussion, I do want to draw your attention to the end of the document, just to note that there exists some very useful practical guidance from others. For example, the Open Research Funders Group has an incentivization blueprint and an openly available set of example policy phrases or templates that can help funders write into their agreements the suggestions or their requirements for sharing research outputs. And we can extend that concept of sharing outputs to other aspects of open science, such as engaging with society. You'll also see some links there to the Center for Open Science, which has a curated resource hub for funders, and the Funders Forum of the Research Data Alliance. You'll find those links again at the end of our draft document. So thank you. And I'd like to open the floor for discussion of this document and of our shared work. As Ezra noted, you can use the chat function. You can raise your hand. We'd love to share the floor here. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Tiffany, for the presentation. As Tiffany said, our idea here really was to provide some high-level guidance as to what are the key ingredients or factors that funders need to take into account when thinking about funding open science. As Tiffany said, we did not go very much into detail because there are other sources for that specifically for funders, but we thought it would be very important to capture the key issues and the key principles that need to be integrated into open funding schemes. We did share the document with you a little bit late. It was just yesterday. We were still working on the last parts of it the other day. So I do hope that you managed to have a look at it. We've shared it also in the chat here with you. So if you have any comments at this stage, I think it would be very useful for us to hear your views, to tell us what is missing or what is good or what is not in the document, and to guide us in the finalization of this guidance for open science funding, because we do start getting requests from different research funding agencies or agents with regards to this guidance for the funding. Yes, I start seeing some hands. Eunice Mercado Lara, the floor is yours. And if you can just very briefly introduce yourself so we know where you're from, that would be great.
Thank you. This is Eunice Mercado Lara. I am from the Open Research Funders Group, helping with a project on open and equitable manners for funders to enable funding programs. And this is very recent. I'm not trying to pretend that I know how it works, but one of the conversations we've had with the community raised the awareness that this is, and I'm sure that you are not making the recommendations in any particular order, but something that we were discussing last week was what is the best order to fund open science in terms of making it representative to the community it aims to serve. And we were thinking about community-led infrastructure. So one of the reflections we had is that perhaps it is worthwhile, and I don't want to put anyone in this spot, but I know some of you were in this call, were in that conversation. So if I'm misrepresenting any of those ideas, feel free to compliment or to correct me. But the idea was more like the creation of a community. It's something that it's important before starting defining the infrastructures and the mechanisms under which that open science is going to happen. And of course, like, it's important to kind of integrate all the stakeholders within that community, then design the project, and then perhaps think about the funding programs or the funding mechanisms those projects are going to need in terms of sustainability and inclusivity. So again, I'll finish as I started. I don't know the answer on how to do it, but I know some real work has been done by organizations in Latin America, like Metadocencia. They are rethinking and evaluating which is the best way to create governance models for their projects. So perhaps that's something we should keep in mind, like what comes first, the egg or the chicken?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's great. That's indeed one of the things to really think about, and that's this investment in the community, who will then be able to define what are the actual needs for a specific project. But as you were saying, it's difficult to say what comes first, what comes next. The important thing is just to kind of think about it and put it all on the paper, and definitely something that needs to be reflected a little bit better in the document as well. And Eunice, it would be great to hear more, if we have time later on. It would be great to hear more about possibly some examples that exist among your funders that have some interesting initiatives or actions that they have been starting to implement, experimenting a little bit with open science funding schemes. So if we have time, maybe we can come back to you and see a little bit if you have some interesting examples to share with us as well. Angela Holzer.
Well, yes, thank you. I hope you can hear me. Thank you very much, Tiffany. And Anna, for introducing the paper. I think it's really a very good read. I have a couple of comments to offer, and I'm happy to also send them to you in writing afterwards so that you can better, see the details. The first question that I had was in the first paragraph, when you lay out what are the funding related provisions. I wondered in the second sentence or the second paragraph why you only refer to governments, research funders, and philanthropists to be encouraged to design and monitor funding and investment policies, because I think actually in order to design and implement these frameworks, basically we should also look at the scientists themselves and look at for example, this scientific societies and so on and so forth, because I think they do have a strong role in also in creating and designing the mechanisms, because the mechanisms cannot be top down. I mean, they need to come from the research communities and be accepted in the research communities themselves as well. Then the second kind of topic that I would like to refer to, point out, is regarding the guidance section, the guidance for open science funding. I very much support the view that when you lay out the open science values, and I think quality and integrity are really key, because open science needs to adhere to the same, good scientific practices that other research does as well. So quality and integrity are key, but I think it's also possible to have, still have in a transitional phase also a science and research that is of high quality and integrity without being open. And I think it's a bit too strong in the document to phrase it the way that only open science can be science of high quality. And this also relates to the second bullet point with the incentives and the grant application processes. And I support the view that assessing and valuing projects needs to be adapted. But I think it cannot be adapted, not all projects, if they follow open science principles, that is good, but it doesn't automatically make them better science. And I think it's very difficult to draw the line and to not confound things, because they can be assessed on, their contribution to open science. But if you can have a closed science project that is really a good quality science project, and only being open doesn't necessarily make it better quality. And I think it's very important to have that the distinction here, and to maybe phrase it that based on the alignment with open science practices, that this is important, but it cannot be the only criterion for assessing research. Then the third topic relates to costs and funding. And I wondered, there's a lot of references to additional costs. And I wondered why there are these additional costs, because what we also should be talking about is transforming the existing infrastructures to become more open. And there is already a lot of investment. And I think it's also about redirecting the investment. And it's not just about additional funding. And I think at some point this also should be mentioned, that it is about reinvesting and transforming existing structures. And then regarding the associated costs as part of the main application budget, I wondered why does it have to be in the main application budget? It could also be that funders provide extra budgets, and this should be a possibility. So I think this should be mentioned as well. And finally, regarding the last bullet point, or the second to last, the increasing of the transparency, I think the way it is phrased now is very good. Because it's about increasing the transparency of the process. But this doesn't have to mean that the process itself needs to be open, because I think it can also have really bad effects on science if all review processes are completely open. And so I applaud the formulation, regarding transparency of the process, so that everybody knows about the steps of the process, but not necessarily about the whole process being open and not anonymous, for example. I think there's some value also in the anonymity of review processes. And the last bullet point from my perspective in the current situation, the discussion of sanctions and of impact on future funding eligibility, I think this goes a bit too far from my perspective currently, because it's not encouraging. So these are the points I would like to mention, and I'm happy to send them to you in writing as well.
That's great, excellent. And indeed, please, if you can send them to us, that would be very, very useful. Of course, we took note, but it's always good to get your feedback in writing as well. And there are several issues there that you have raised that we have actually thought of and just did not know how to address yet, and wanted to feel what the group is thinking and what's the right way to formulate some of these issues. Going back, maybe just to address some of your points, since I don't see any hands up yet, so we can continue this discussion and then we'll see other people who will come in. In the first part, the reason why it talks about governments, research funders, philanthropists, and not including everybody else, everything that is in the first part is really taken from the provisions from the recommendation. So it's kind of exactly where funding has been specifically mentioned in the recommendation. That doesn't mean that the recommendation later on does not say that all the process should be inclusive, and maybe we should add it at this stage as well. But here we just pulled the exact references from the recommendation. There is absolutely the need to mention in one way or another the fact that it is not all additional cost. It is a matter of shifting costs, or as you said, reevaluating what we already have and then trying to just invest differently, although we're not talking about additional cost as well. And it is true, I actually made that note this morning when I was rereading the document, and I said we definitely something that needs to be put in there as well. Assessment of research, these are all things that we are still working on in different working groups and more broadly as a science community. Assessment is something that we are looking into. Definitely a transition phase is needed. But we are here addressing those who really do want to fund open science. So this is for those who are into funding open science, which does not mean that everybody has to. And the idea in an ideal world, science will become open science by definition in the future. We will not even have to say it. For the moment, this guidance is for those who do want open science. Hence, quality in openness and value in openness that we needed to put there as well. And then the transparency of the process, and I see a little bit of discussion there, and I will get back to some of the colleagues who are putting things in the chat. Whether it's with the funding process, whether it's with the peer review process, there is this whole, again, discussion about how open should these processes be. Is it about everything being open and you know everything out there, or how do we kind of balance the openness with the non-openness in a sense? So very, very good points. We'll try to pull it together. The fact that the last one is too strong, we know, but it is also true that we have also heard from many people saying, if there is no way of ensuring that things actually do happen, if there is no, then it's very difficult to actually make things move. So maybe we can smooth it out a little bit, but it is also important to say, okay, this is compliance, this is non-compliance. And when you do not comply, explain why. So that's kind of that was the idea behind this last bullet point. Tiffany, do you maybe want to respond to a few things, and then I'll ask a few colleagues who have put their posts in the chat to also share their thoughts with us. Yes, Tiffany, please.
Sure, yeah, just building on that last point about eligibility for future funding, about making sure that these funding decisions have teeth. I think it's important to remember that the recommendation does specify itself, and of course we can build on this as needed in future, but it does specify when research might not be open for justified reasons. When the open knowledge would threaten sacred or secret indigenous knowledge, when it would place endangered species at risk, and so on. So I don't think we're saying everything has to be open, no exceptions across the board, one case fits all. Rather, we do want to move to a system that is open by default and creates not just allowance, but creates a system that works for those individual cases where there might be a different approach. And let's make sure that our funding system is ready for that kind of consideration. Because right now, if we just have a funding system and then separately later on we look to see if the outputs of science are open, they're not connected in the way that we would need to really have an equitable transformation to open science. And that's our intent. I absolutely think we can do a better job with the wording of it. And thank you for your suggestions on wording. I think we agree with a lot of these wonderful feedback that you have. And we will take that into the English language used in the document. So thank you. I don't think I have anything more to add on. I'd rather have other voices.
Okay. I wanted to see Antonio Schettino, if it's possible. I like the chat, the post that he put in the chat about the distinction between quality and openness. Antonio, if you could share with us your thoughts, if it's possible for you to bad microphone, that's too bad, but I do encourage you to look into, I can read it out because I thought it was interesting. So the distinction between quality and openness is important. So it would be good to emphasize that closed research projects can be of good quality, but A, cannot be inspected, and B, cannot be built upon by other researchers. Hence the invitation to openness. Because of these important properties, funding bodies may want to incentivize responsible openness and transparency. So I think it's a very nice way of kind of explaining. It's not a one versus the other, it's just the way that we perceive it now. I see Jean-Emmanuel and Christopher Erdmann. So we start with Jean-Emmanuel.
Thank you. Jean-Emmanuel Faure, I'm working in the European Commission in the Directorate General for Research and Innovation in the Open Science Unit, and more particularly on the reform of research assessment with the initiative we are developing currently with stakeholders. I would have two comments I screened through quite quickly, I have to say. Your draft guidance, and we'll be ready to provide more detailed comments. I'd like to echo a little bit what has been said earlier. The focus on funders is interesting, but there are many other stakeholders that are involved in funding and in making the practice of open science a reality. In particular, all research performing organizations, and I believe they should be mentioned because it is also the support they provide to the services, the infrastructures, to the people who are data stewards, who are software engineers, etc., sustaining the variety of competences and careers that are needed to practice open science. And I think this should be relayed in a way in this guidance. So going beyond funders. Of course, funders are absolutely key, and they can also be good examples and lead the way, because the criteria they place with their funding is very critical and will have a very high impact. But it's also about the institutions that practice open science and in their decisions, in their strategies. First point. The second point is you refer to the different types of costs. So indeed, services, infrastructures, etc. And you mentioned capacity. I think something that could be strengthened is education. I would imagine that you cover this under capacity building. Yeah. I think it goes maybe a little bit beyond capacity building in terms of training, etc. It goes to education. It can go to early education, and this requires investments. How to practice responsible research and open science at large. These are my two main comments, and we would be able to come back to you with more details and potentially additional ideas. Thank you.
That's great. Thanks so much. And if you have anything in writing, just please send it to us, because some of your thoughts were very, very useful, and we can pick a little bit from there. In precisely saying, okay, this may be for funders. However, the funding and investment in open science is broader than just specific funders or philanthropists. Very, very well noted. Great. Thanks so much. Christopher.
Yeah, and thank you, Anna. I won't turn on my camera because it's early where I'm at. It's actually one of the parts of this document had me thinking, and it was about transitioning from funding that is heavily focused on projects to providing institutional core funding, including for permanent positions, long terms. So what triggered me on that was a conversation we're actually having. I'm at the Chan Zuckerberg Initiative right now, CZI, and we have some great groups here, including one called 2I2C. And I'm just using it as an example. It's an interesting approach to providing shared infrastructure. Mm-hmm. And when I look at this, I think, okay, well, I think of the research software engineers. I think of this initiative to hire, local research software engineers, but I also think about this shared service, right? And are we creating a challenge here again, where it's like everyone creates separate repositories and creates these separate positions, when we don't necessarily think about this shared approach of sharing, which should be high paid positions, these research software engineers. So I was thinking more about the role, right? Like how the role should be, that somehow the role should be elevated and funded or something like that, versus the positions. And, projects are still, project-based funding is actually still actually a good thing, because it's led to all the open science initiatives, that are out there. Like it is, it's not, it is like a crazy space to be in as far as sustainability. I see at the meeting I'm at right now, they're all trying to get additional funding, right, to keep some of these open science projects going. But they were inspired by these project-based, funding to begin with. And so I was just wondering about that, because you also later in the document, you actually refer to projects and assessing projects. So there's that contradiction. So I'm just, and also I brought it up in the chat, but yeah, I think someone else mentioned it, but societies seem to be missing, like the publishers were mentioned, but societies, where the researchers are. So maybe that's where you're saying researchers, I don't know about those distinctions, or information specialists and librarians. And I think a little bit more wording needs to happen there between those distinctions.
That's very good, Chris. And again, please do send us your inputs in writing. We are very happy to take on board the inputs that arrive. We have kind of based the draft on what we have received so far and what is in the recommendation, but very, very happy to expand and to include things that we did not really think about so far. Tiffany, anything from your side?
Sure. Just on that last point about projects, I don't think it's our place to, and I don't think we're ready to give up on projects or switch to one mode or the other. It brings up an interesting point of where innovation happens. What is the role of one-off projects, which can be incredible spaces for creativity, versus a coherent long-term approach to make sure that the best of the infrastructures, public goods, knowledge that is produced, often in a project-based environment, is still available. because what we're hearing right now from those who are developing open science infrastructures, from those who are trying to share these open ways of working and tools for working, is that the one-off competition for 1 to 3 year project funding isn't working. And it's part of the reason it doesn't work is because we like to reward novelty and exploration, and there's less support for administration and the long-term costs required to support these services over the long term. But as a community, we need to balance that. We think we need more clarity on what funding is available and is being directed towards these open tools. What are the gaps that they face? Of course, we have the Infrastructures Working Group is asking that question, but it's a funding question as well. What is the best way to, like you say, create shared goods with long-term support without hindering innovation and creativity? I think it's an open question, and we'll do a better job trying to represent that complexity. And you'll see projects in this document because of the reality of how science is functioning and is funded. So I don't think that's going to...
And it's definitely, yes, no, I completely agree. And definitely this idea of shared infrastructures, and particularly when it comes to funding for open science, it's something that has to be very specific and a little bit more taken out, because it's in a way a novelty. The novelty of open science is the shared infrastructures. And I've seen also in the chat several colleagues also saying that it's important to invest in that and to make it more visible in the document. So we'll do that as well. I wanted to see, just going back a little bit to this, there are a couple of things that are coming out from the chat that might be interesting to look into. One is this idea of open evaluations and transparency in the process. I saw Fernanda Bagel also posted on that. It is true, it was something that was discussed during all our meetings, consultations, meetings, to come up with the text of the recommendation. Fernanda, maybe you want to just pick up on that a little bit, on openness of evaluation processes and also openness of funding processes. If your internet connection is okay, it would be great to hear a little bit more about that and see if there is anything else in the document that we should mention in that regard.
Hi, Anna, thanks. I'm going to try with the camera, and good morning to all. I was just saying, and this would be very, very brief, I think that the discussion really opened the issue of open evaluation, and we saw that there were many different opinions. And I think that there was not the final solution, because indeed, to surpass the anonymity, for example, that was the colleague mentioning, right, of peer review is not something that is confirmed as definitely a good idea. I mean, it depends completely, because you can have like a non-desirable consequence of opening evaluation. So I think that the conclusion was really that we were not ready to have an open evaluation proposal directly, right? So I think that's important to take into account. We have diversity, I think, in the academic community in the whole world. And I was just going to comment on another thing, Anna. So maybe if you want to keep on going with open evaluation, I can come back later.
No, go ahead, Fernanda.
So the other issue is also brief, but I think that in this document that I read, is the draft, and in the whole issue of funding and incentives for open science funding, we have to face one of the things that it is indeed in the document, in the recommendation, and it is APC or BPC, I mean, article processing charges, or the process of open access. I agree with Guillermo. Of course, open access to papers is very, very far from being the main issue, but in the countries that are not being able to face the transformative agreements that are proposed in a very, very high funding well, my English is terrible today. With many funds as they are really demanded right now, what we are facing in the studies that we've performed just now in Latin America is that the APC funding is increasing, not funding, the APC cost is increasing every month. And so in the cases that we've studied now, which you can have available literature on Chile, Colombia, I mean, many countries in Latin America. And you can see that for a period of 4 or 5 years, you have like $11, $13 million of expenses. And so the countries are facing now the need to fund open science, but mostly the funds are going all to APC. And so what can we do to find a global solution to this? That's just all I wanted to say.
Yeah, well, Fernanda, there you're like, oh, here is the most difficult issue, one of the most difficult issues, and absolutely, I think it's the reality now for many countries, and that is now kind of becoming the biggest cost related to operationalization and implementation of open science. It's actually the very high cost of article processing charges or book processing charges. We are starting to have a conversation, and we can share with the group after that invitation to a series of workshops that will be organized in different regions precisely to look into a more equitable way of publishing and possible models that would not rely on APCs. I mean, even the open access publishers are struggling with that, not all of them, but some of them, realizing this is not the model, because this just turns open science on its head again, and are trying to figure out some community-based models or some other models which are not necessarily the transformative agreements, because as you say, transformative agreements again go to those who can fund those transformative agreements. Again, we're not in an equitable setting here. So we will invite you to also follow these really are these ongoing discussions with different actors, whether it's researchers, whether it's publishers, whether it's funders. There is willingness to find some kind of solutions. Some things are starting to pop up. PLOS has a few interesting models, but it needs to be scaled up. It needs to be really something to put out there a little bit more. At the same time, what I am taking for our document here at this stage is also that we have to be a little bit more specific in just saying and writing what we do mention it a little bit in the document. We didn't want to go too much into detail, but we do need to mention it maybe more specifically, because it is a cost that needs to be, for the moment, covered by the funders, because there's otherwise it's really the cost of individual researchers themselves, which was not the original idea. Thanks so much for that, Fernanda. Good to have you with us. Tiffany, yes, sorry, you wanted to say something.
Sure, just a couple points off that. Regarding APCs, that's one reason why the document makes reference to core funding versus additional funding, because we've seen in certain areas where there is a special fund set aside for publishing, let's say for releasing outputs, that sometimes they're first come, first serve, and there's a limited amount of funding. So there's a pressure to publish quickly rather than well in order to nab that funding before it goes away. And that's a problem that we want to try to avoid. But I think this brings up an interesting question of, until now, we've been focusing mostly on the funding that flows into science or open science. And I think we need to pay attention and make sure that all of us are aware of the funding that comes out of science, who is making money off of science, whether it is a commercial publisher, or I think Aini Enfman brought up the issue of intellectual property rights and copyright, recognizing that there are ways to make a commercial product off of even open science hardware or other open knowledge. I think that we as a community aren't necessarily on top of where the money is being made and how much is being made and how it lines up with the creation of scientific knowledge around the world and where it doesn't match the creation of scientific knowledge around the world. I think we have a lot of questions to ask ourselves, and this is partly why I put in the document the bits about transparency that I was hearing from you as well, because I think we need to do a better job of tracking those financial flows. We can't make good decisions about these financial flows until we know exactly what they are and who is and who isn't included. So thank you, Fernanda, for bringing that up.
Great. I have one more comment that I like in the chat, and I wanted to just unpack it a little bit. It's from Hannah. I think the others we have more or less covered in the discussions. From Hannah Schmagun about the possible checklist of what needs to be funded and how. Hannah, if you can connect and if you can tell us a little bit more what you were thinking here, might be useful to hear your thoughts on that. Hannah, I'm just going to see if she's still connected.
So she says she's not in a good place to speak. So maybe I'll just read out her comment. She had mentioned that for considering from a policy approach, whether it's national or institutional, she suggests it would be beneficial to have a kind of clear checklist on what we want to fund, aligning it with the pillars of open science from the recommendation, and how or to what extent, for example, through the project's fund budget or by creating extra funding. I think this brings up a question for us to consider how specific we want to be, should be, need to be in terms of what we want to fund or how we want to fund it, recognizing that we're trying to give guidance to everyone who's implementing the recommendation. So this has to be globally relevant. And as others have mentioned in this call, there needs to be room for innovation. There needs to be room for local context in funding. I see some concern about being overly prescriptive. If we try to say open science funding must be this and must be this only, we risk stifling what might work in one place for another. But I think what Hannah is trying to have us move towards is clearer guidance, a way for us to check. Like this document that you see in front of you asks the question about balance among the pillars of open science, but do we need to be more specific with that? Here are some options and ideas for how we can fund or provide financial support to open engagement with society, open dialogue with other knowledge systems, open science infrastructure, and so on. Perhaps. Okay, Hannah's saying she'll send us more details later. Thank you. But if anyone wants to jump in on that point.
About being, yeah. We were just thinking, for example, there are some ideas for setting up some regional mechanisms for open science funding. And this document was kind of written in that context, thinking, okay, we would need to provide them something that they can use as a framework when they establish their mechanism. However, they will have to contextualize it for their needs, for their communities, for their context, local, national, regional, etc. So that was the reason why we didn't want to go too much into detail and being too prescriptive, as Tiffany was saying, and keep it at the level of as we were saying, high level guidance. Any other comment? Any other comment or any other ideas that you would like to share with us? So there is also this idea of, yes, investment in education, as Jean-Emmanuel was saying, and then schools. I think we can put this inside the idea of shared infrastructures, open science, knowledge that comes with it. I think we have more or less covered everything that was there. Chris, is that you have your hand up, please?
Yeah, I was trying to write this out, and again, it's early and I'm trying to form thoughts. but I didn't know where the APC conversation came from. Like, is that included in the document? I tried to do just a search right now, but if it is, or if this is a topic, then I think like then preprints should be discussed. And for the reason that they I spend a great deal of my time in physics and astronomy, and archive preprint servers, just it changed things, for everyone, for access. And I had, there's stories, like especially from someone like Fernando Perez, Jupiter project here. He learned through the preprint server archive, computer science. And so, like, having that access besides the journals has been critical. But the thing is, like, how long has the archive been around and there's still journals? There's still the journal article, and people still want to publish there. It's reduced costs, to some extent. But like, and I've also noticed when I was in astronomy, that people would access, there were services that would provide alternative links, right? So you could go to the journal, or you could go to the preprint, and people often didn't really notice those the difference, really, like, because of how the systems worked and the access. And so I don't know. I just wanted the sort of preprint conversation to be in that APC conversation then, if it wasn't, because it's a hot topic here at CZI. There are a lot of preprint servers here, and how to sort of support them and fund them. So
no, that's a good point, and we have to see how, to what extent to include it in this document. We can think about it and then get back to you also and see the right way of including it, if not in this document, then certainly in the documents that will follow as well. And this is just to remind everybody that this document, as a guidance for funding, open science funding, is part of a larger set of documents, tools, which is the Open Science Toolkit that we are producing now. With the help of the different working groups, there will be different bits and pieces in this toolkit. And some of these issues we can also use either a fact sheet or another guidance or another piece where we can really dive into more details in some of these issues. And definitely the challenges of open science, or unintended consequences of open science, was one of the issues that we wanted to explore. We will come to that, and maybe at that point we can bring in these conversations and go a little bit more in depth with them as well, while keeping the funding more broader, and maybe just somehow make reference to some other pieces. We have to see how to include these discussions, because they are critical, and we have to make sure that we cover them properly in the right place, and with the right tools for all those who would need them to implement open science. Tiffany, is there anything else that you would like to bring up at this stage?
I think this is great. We're receiving a lot of specific input through the chat and others. So,
good. Maybe we can then go to our next steps and conclusions. I think Ezra, you or Ferry will share the screen. Ezra will guide us through the next steps, what we are thinking, and yes, still really looking forward to your inputs to get the second version finalized.
Okay, thank you. Thanks very much, Anna, and thank you, Tiffany, and more importantly, thanks to everyone for the discussion, for all those contributors, for the useful comments, questions, the guidance, the clarification. Is all very much appreciated. As Tiffany just said there, we've received a lot, and we'll have to go through it all very carefully. So yeah, as mentioned, let's just go through some of the next steps foreseen for this particular working group, or even for this section of this working group. So in addition to thanking you for all those comments and information just provided. We could please request that you provide us with additional information, especially those who've made comments and offered or suggested or offered to provide written comments as well. That would be very much appreciated if it's additional information or more information, or indeed those who didn't speak but put something in the chat. If you could give us more information on that, it would be very much appreciated. So we'll invite you and encourage you to please provide those comments. We're hoping to finalize this document in the coming months. So if we could please ask that you could provide your further comments and inputs by the 3rd of October. So that gives us 3 weeks or so. And please use the email on the screen. Get in touch with us if you have any problems. So we can finalize that document. And yeah, just to recall, of course, we're open to inputs on both of these major components, but currently we're just really focusing on the financing mechanisms at the moment. So we'll focus on that. And just to mention, we'll also be seeking inputs. I know the issue of funders came up and we had some discussion, and there's some good comments on the area of funders, but we also plan to seek to get inputs and feedback from a number of funding bodies ahead of and during the World Science Forum, which is held in December in Cape Town, South Africa. And I will just mention, so this is a kind of thank you for all the information we've received, and a request and encouragement to provide more detail from what you said, and new things if they haven't been brought up here, or maybe from the discussion some things have been raised and some areas that would be useful. So please, it's an open invitation to provide that information. And just to mention on the other side, let's say the other component where we're looking at the assessments and evaluation criteria of researchers' careers and so on. For that, we'll plan to have a meeting in January of next year. So kind of in parallel, we'll start preparing for that and hope to have discussions on that as a second area. So if you jump to the next slide, please. Okay, so just to keep you up to date with the other working groups, if you look at the agenda here, the timetable here, you'll see, today, 20th of September, we had funding and incentives. So for those interested, the next working groups coming up are the second working groups on open science capacity building in 26th of September, so just under a week's time, and then 30th of September, open science infrastructures. You're more than welcome to join and participate in those if you don't already. If you look at the website, which will come up in subsequent pages, and I see it's just come in the chat. Thanks very much, Laura. So if you're interested in those, please feel free to sign up. They're open to everyone to join. Okay, yeah, we can go to the next slide, thanks. And just to mention again, hopefully you've seen this before, but if you haven't, please, you'll see this slide. The presentations will be shared afterwards, so you'll have the link, and I'm sure that link can be put in the chat as well. So the global call for best practices is still open, and we again encourage you to provide information on best practices in open science. And that, of course, can be related to what we're discussing today, but also for all other areas on in the context of best practices in open science. And you can find out more information on this call for best practices here on this this link here. So I believe that brings us to the end of our session. You'll see the contact email here and the website here. Please feel free to contact us if anything isn't clear, if you wish to have anything, and of course for the submissions that we've requested. So before closing the meeting, I'll just ask perhaps if Anna or Tiffany wishes to add anything at this stage.
No, thank you, Ezra. I think you've covered everything very nicely. As you said, we are looking forward to your comments in writing. Go through the document. We shared it in Word file, So you can really, you know, put your changes inside, and then we'll share with you the next version, and then if there are some additional things to change, we can still change them. As Ezra was saying, we're kind of planning to launch the first parts of the toolkit, which are the deliverables basically of the different working groups, in December. But knowing that these are all open documents that can be changed as we learn more, as we have more information, as the communities start to understand what else is missing, what else needs to be changed, etc. So we certainly do not see any of this guidance as, you know, top-down approach that is like that and will never change. But we'll try to keep it a process, because different countries and different institutions and different actors are learning in a different way, and that will hopefully feed our work as well in supporting the member states with the implementation of the recommendation. Also, as Ezra was saying, for the part on the incentives and looking into evaluation schemes and criteria for evaluation of research careers and researchers, we need a little bit more time to understand what different regions are thinking and doing in this area. We know that a lot is happening in Europe and North America, but we have not seen that much yet in other regions, and want to understand a little bit more what their needs are before we start engaging you and us in a discussion on that particular issue. So as Ezra was saying, we are thinking of a meeting in January, but we will come back to you with some ideas for reflection in the meantime. And yes, I think that would be all from me. And thank you really very much for the participation and for all the inputs. It's very, very useful for us.
Yeah, I shall echo that. It's certainly very useful, very interesting. We had a lot of information, comments, guidance, and we need to kind of work our way through that and update the document with what was discussed today, plus the additional things which we invited. So with that, let me say a huge thank you again to everyone. Thanks very much for your time. Thanks very much for the participation today and the active participation, both by speech and in the chat. And we look forward to receiving these things. So we look forward to continued discussion. And let me say thanks very much. We can now close the meeting. Thank you. Thanks.
Thank you.